Nick, when you think of a first-time home buyer, just like draw the picture in your head for a second. Who is that person? How old are they? What do they do? And what kind of property are they buying? And what does the current version of that buyer look like in your mind? And what does the old version of that buyer look like in your mind?
Uh, yeah. I mean, first time home buyer, first time, you're thinking younger individual, maybe younger couple, probably in a smaller, maybe rural house or kind of mid market. Maybe if you're in a city, maybe you're in like a condo or a townhome kind of thing, probably hopefully earlier in your career. You're likely scraping together some funds for down payment, maybe getting some help from family, but it's the old idea of getting on that housing ladder, right?
Yeah.
You're probably not someone. You hope your age starts with a 2 or a 3 is kind of what I'm getting at, I guess. But same question
Yeah.
back to you. When you hear first time home buyer, who do you picture, and what has changed, I guess, about that picture?
So I think everything that you just said, like the only thing I would add is, when people like are younger, they tend to live in urban areas, maybe condos, and you're downtown, close proximity to jobs and potential mates. And then you find said potential mate and you are starting a new relationship, right? So you're either moving from being a renter into like your typically your first like household formation event and becoming like a couple and deciding to buy a house to start like accumulating that nest egg in your relationship. I think like that would be like the life event. I think that leads people to becoming a first time buyer. But alas, the title of this episode with a major spoiler in it tells us that is no longer the first time buyer in Ontario and in much of Canada. And this is why the data that came out of Terranet's Ontario report matters a lot. The average first time homebuyer in Ontario is now 40 years old. This is, to me, I think the market telling us that the entry point for people getting on the housing ladder that you described is, early adult now to, or what, sorry, it went from early adult now to like mid career, like your midlife crisis as you buying a house. Yeah. Yeah. And the weird part is that like first time homebuyers aren't actually gone. Probably the most interesting data point I found in that 2025 Ontario report from Terranet is first time homebuyers are actually, for the first time in over a decade, the most active buyer segment in the market. Multi-property owners, which is how Terranet classifies investors, are basically, they've fallen from first place to third place. So the story is becoming, first time homebuyers are really getting back into the market. And, young people didn't give up over that period of time. They're the most eager to get back into the market. The first time homebuyer is still showing up, but they're a lot older. It takes them a lot longer to save money. They're more dependent on multiple incomes or co-signing from their parents. They likely need more help. And they're operating in a market where the old investor bid isn't carrying everything anymore. And they're competing less with real estate investors.
Yeah. I mean, and look, Dan, to your point, this is not just an Ontario episode. We don't like to do that to the rest of Canada, but Ontario, in a lot of cases, this being one of them, is the sharpest data point that Terranet has, that level of data for. And of course, our big chunk of our audience is here in Ontario. But this is still a Canadian show. Okay. The Bank of Canada has first time home buyers at roughly half of mortgaged home purchases since 2014. So over a decade now. But CMHC's 2026 mortgage survey actually shows that first-time buyers are renting longer, saving longer, and almost a third of them need a co-signer outside of course, that spouse or partner in that capacity. So, re-enter the bank of mom and dad here. So this is really about, this episode, and this unfortunate statistic is really about the entry point of that buyer, that first-time buyer here in Canada. So who are they? Let's talk about that, why the investors have taken a bit of a backseat and walked things back, and what it means to be underwriting deals, buying your first home, advising clients if you are a professional in this industry, or pretending affordability can be fixed by, just piling on more debt. So, Dan, before we get into it, we haven't done this in a while, and I just actually, this will be out later, but I just did post today on LinkedIn and Instagram, 400 episodes, actually 4 years to the date. We're recording this on July 8th. This might be out in a week or so, but Yeah, man, 4 years, lots of reviews, lots of amazing people. This one is from a first-time buyer who said they listened to the show while they were trying to buy their first house, and the biggest thing it gave them was a better way to think through the numbers instead of just reacting emotionally to listings. Thank you for that review. If you like what you're hearing, go leave us a review. And Dan, that's exactly who this episode is for.
And if that's you, go to realist.ca. It's our underwriting deal intelligence platform that we're building for Canadian real estate investors and serious buyers who want to use data to make their real estate purchase decisions. Check out the deal of the day, which we're going to start presenting on the show again. Run the numbers and use it before you fall in love with a piece of dirt, which is one of the worst things you can do in this business.
Yeah, don't do that. It's a one-sided relationship always. Come to one of our meetups as well. We have our multiplex event September 15th in Toronto, November 18th in Montreal. Super excited about those. Rooms full of great people. Dan, we've got a lot to get through. Let's do the little like kind of high level what we're going to be talking about today. Here's basically a high level version of what we're going to be talking about over the next 40 minutes. Terranet's Q1 report. The Terranet had the average age of 36 back in 2015. 2020 it was 38. In 2025 it hit 40 years old. That means that the first purchase moves 4 years later in a decade. That is kind of crazy. That math is kind of scary. Multiple property owners, aka investors, a lot of you listening to the show, we fell from first to third. Does that mean affordability is fixed? Does that mean Canada's not a good place to invest in real estate anymore? Does it mean the buyer is now fixed? Lots to talk about.
Yeah, I guess we're going to find out in this episode. The other piece we're going to explore, obviously, with the understanding that this is a national show and the Terranet data is just Ontario, which is like 60% of our audience. So we try and, at least cater to that large group when we can. We're also going to talk about the national level because first-time homebuyers in Canada are the biggest. Bank of Canada has them at roughly half of mortgage home purchases nationally since 2014. Repeat buyers were around 31%, and then investors were only about 19%. So this idea that we demonize real estate investors for like taking over the market or whatever, when they're like at the time they're the smallest buyer at a national level, it really maybe is just more of an Ontario and BC or some of these less affordable market kind of thing. So first-time homebuyers, not a niche group at all. They're often the bottom rung of the transaction chain. They're the ones who sort of push your market up from the bottom. They're buying some of the cheapest houses. And the challenge, and the reason why I think this is super relevant, is if that bottom rung of the housing ladder, to bring it back to what you said at the beginning of the episode, can't clear, if it's not transacting, then any of those move-up buyers stop being able to have somebody. They don't have exit liquidity. They're not able to sell their house to somebody, so they can't buy. And so this is why the first-time homebuyer problem becomes a whole market problem pretty quickly, and why it actually is pretty reassuring as a bull case for Canadian real estate that first-time homebuyers are the ones who are eagerly jumping into, I want to say, start this knife catching contest maybe in the Canadian housing market right now. They're the bold ones.
Yeah. Look, I mean, CMHC does give us a bit of like the deeper, more intricate look at what's happening here, right? I mean, first-time homebuyers rented for over 7.5 years on average as of 2026. That's up from the prior survey, which was just over 6 years. So well over another year, almost a year and a half renting. 28%, so almost 30% needed a cosigner outside of, again, their spouse, their partner, whatever. 27% received a gift. Lucky y'all. The starter home became a bit of a household balance sheet project. It's still an emotional purchase, but the numbers matter more now than ever. 2 incomes, family support, renting longer, more compromises, later age of purchase. The idea of just getting that condo and working your way up to your dream home by the time you're 40, I don't know. Not right now.
Yeah, and the CMHC data you're referencing, for those following along on video, we're posting full episodes on YouTube now, so you can see all the data that we're pulling up on the recording. And average time renting varies a lot province by province. So you go, Ontario's 7 years. Ontario's somehow the lowest, which I've also found fascinating. BC 8.7 years is the highest, and then you have the Prairies is just under 8 years. Quebec is 7.7, and Atlantic Canada is 7.2 years. So there's a big variance, but
Yeah.
every single area over 7 years. So, for investors, the implication is simple. Like, these are the people renting houses. You have long-term tenants that before they get into entry level housing. But the other piece is exit liquidity. First time home buyers buy entry level houses. Investors very much often buy entry level houses that maybe need some fixing up, or they're, wartime bungalow where you can add a basement apartment or whatever. Investors, our models can often say we have the X resale value, and that depends on whatever thesis playing out. But the market still has to produce future buyers with incomes and down payments and confidence and lender approval. And, the next generation, I know I feel like we rag on Gen Z a lot on the show. So, but I really feel for them, man. Like, they have the highest youth unemployment that we've seen in history. And I don't know, it could have something to do with their haircuts, but maybe it doesn't, right? Like, and so if the likely exit buyer for you as a real estate investor is a first time home buyer, you need to underwrite what is 10 years from now, all of the Gen Zs, are they going to have jobs for me are they going to be gainfully employed for me to be able to sell them houses? Because that's a valid question based on employment trends in Canada right now. So let's dive into kind of just like the way that housing language wraps around first time home buyers. People say like starter home, and they talk about it like it means the same thing that it meant 30 years ago. Small house, young couple, early career, maybe suburbanizing and scraping together this down payment and getting on the housing ladder, like you said. But in a lot of Canadian markets, that's not the real first-time home buyer anymore. Real first-time home buyer might be 40 years old. They have just been renting for 7 to 9 years, like we learned. They probably have dual income households, dinks, I think they call them, right? Dual income, no kids.
That's it.
That's it. They, based on some of the CMHC data, they might have parents co-signing, which is huge. They might have rented for 8 years. They might be stretching to the top of their approval, which I think 38% of first-time home buyers admitted to doing that, buying the maximum that they could afford, and maybe making compromises still on location and size and condition and property type. It's not the starter buyer in the way our parents talk about starter homes, And the other thing that happened a little bit between that period of time was like houseflation, right? Like, the average house size in Canada, we've talked about this a lot. They make for great multiplex candidates, but the houses grew a lot and they got more expensive. And so there's been a lot of filtering in the asset type, but also in your buyer. The buyer has been filtered.
100%. I think that like filtered buyer is a bit of a key phrase, right? People, when people say that first time buyer is active again, you hear that first time, it sounds like the door is opening, things are healing, right? There's the young people can buy homes, but it might just mean that those people survived the affordability filter. Those are the ones that are able to transact. And that can be a person that, again, has rented for almost a decade, has help. Like, the first time home buyer, Dan, has changed drastically. So, what does that look like for you? If that average first time home buyer is 40, what does that tell you about the market right now?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I think it tells me that house prices or incomes, like, the ability for people to afford houses is just three variables. It's interest rates, it's incomes, and it's house prices. And all of those are not going in anybody's favor right now. Like, wages are barely outpacing inflation. House prices are really high relative to incomes, like as a multiple of incomes. Areas in Ontario, 7x, BC's like 9x. Some of the prairies you're getting to like 5x. The Atlantic Canada, kind of the same thing. And again, we've talked about this in all of our CREA stats recordings. Those are the markets where they're transacting, because first time home buyers can afford to buy houses. So something's broken in the housing model. It's very expensive. People are suffering from, they're experiencing a lot of inflation, and that's making it difficult for them to start, financial lives with their partners and whatever. It takes them longer to save for a down payment. Banks are more scrutinized a lot more on underwriting. So there are some bottlenecks that could, I feel like, really that are clearly causing delays in this major life milestone in Canada. And I think it's very worth paying attention to, which is why we're doing an entire episode on it. It also, because in Canada we rely on real estate to build wealth, or primary residence in a lot of cases to build wealth, it delays later homeownership, kind of compresses that wealth building through real estate timeline.
Okay, so let's hit the TerraNet points clearly here. This is some pretty important stuff. TerraNet says first-time homebuyers became the most active buyer segment in Ontario. Multi-property owners fell from first to third, so still on the podium of real estate purchasing, I guess, Stan, from first to third here. The average first-time buyer rose again, 36 in 2015, 38 in 2020, and 40 in 2025. Ontario is not, most of this data is from Ontario, but this is not some irrelevant side market that's not, going to impact the rest of the country. It's the largest housing market, huge share of our audience. And
it's like, it
really
becomes a big leading indicator too, right?
Yeah. It's like the testing ground for a lot of this kind of stuff, right? So the useful question is not, is it the exact same everywhere? Because the simple answer is no. We know that after covering data across Canada for years, nothing's the same. The useful question is the mechanism other expensive Canadian markets are using, should we be watching that? Should we be studying this and what's happening in other markets to try to fix what's happening in ours?
Yeah, I think so. Like, mortgage underwriting for the most part is the same across the country. And when we covered the most recent CREA stats, like we talked about the tale of two markets and how Ontario and BC are getting smoked and everywhere else is seeing all-time highs. Well, if they go down the same path that Ontario and BC went down, where house prices eventually become out of reach for your average buyer, they suffer the same fate. Buyers can't qualify. Payments get too high if rates don't come down and prices are going up and incomes don't outpace inflation, or income growth is not evenly distributed across the economy because there's rising unemployment, especially in entry-level labor, which is the most impacted by things like AI, as an example. And you see the highest unemployment rates in young people. Young people are piling on more debt. They're not doing it as much as older generations, actually, which is interesting. But they're still the most indebted generation technically in history. And so your existing debts, that's a big piece of the puzzle, whether or not your parents are helping you and you're getting like positive wealth effect, borrowing against your inheritance kind of thing. You're one of the, was it 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 people who's getting a gifted down payment from your parents, or getting a cosign 40%. I think it was like cosign or gifts 40 or 41% and that's a national data
Crazy.
point. Getting a cosign or a gift. Stress tests still matter, and they matter more for people who are buying with a big mortgage than upsizers who are already pulling equity to do it. So and the person that we're real estate investors are selling houses to, maybe not fourplexes, et cetera. And I think you start to hedge against this risk as you become somebody who's developing plexes or something that's not, we're not talking buy and hold single family housing anymore, but your next generation of buyers doesn't feel that strong based on a lot of the data.
Yeah, and this is where people kind of can misread that data, right? Again, first-time home buyers becoming the biggest segment. If you're just one of those people that reads the headlines, that can sound bullish, but it can also mean investors stepped back and repeat buyers froze for a certain reason. So, real quick, Dan, is this bullish or bearish? What do you think?
I think it's bullish on the face that your marginal buyer is participating again, and they tend to be have a positive influence on broad market sentiment. So I would say it's good news that first-time home buyers and if you go back to that chart on TerraNet or on the Bank of Canada website, like Bank of Canada, over 70% of buyers are either first-time or second-time buyers. So they have control of the market at a national level. In Ontario, they lost control. In BC, they lost control. They've regained control. Now, your two biggest types of buyers are first-time or second-time home buyers, or like they call them life event buyers, and investors are no longer. This is good for investors because we now have a more healthy and competitive market to transact. we're competing for some product types with people who maybe are qualitatively more incentivized to pay higher because they love the house or what. I can see my family, like, this is my forever home or whatever. But, I think that the bullishness of it kind of dies when you get to the 40-year number. Like, first-time home buyers are the biggest buyers, but they're older than ever, and that's where you start to kind of see the social issue associated with it a little bit, right? That they're able to take control of the market because they've been saving for way longer, and they're middle aged,
been in the workforce for 20 years, right? In some capacity,
exactly.
or more, right? I mean, like, I started working at 16, that's a long way away from 40. And when you're 16 or 20 or 25, 40 seems old. I mean, as a guy approaching 40, it's not. Okay, so chill, everybody. But when you're in your early 20s, 40 seems old. So let's talk about why this is, again, a Canadian story, and not, for the people listening in the prairies and the East Coast, essentially anywhere outside of Ontario and BC, thinking, okay, well, that's just an Ontario thing. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the Bank of Canada analyzed some notes, and the classified mortgage buyers into first-time buyers, repeat buyers, and investors. Okay, so those are the three categories we're looking at. And nationally, first-time buyers had generally accounted for about half of mortgaged home purchases since 2014. Repeat buyers around 31%, and investors around 19%. That first-time home buyer was never a fringe category, okay? But they are the base of the resale market. They are the base of the smaller unit that, in a lot of transactions, that's the bottom rung. And that, I'm not saying that in a bad way, right? You don't need a ton of space if you're a single person or just a couple buying a property. You might have a dog to start off with, but you buy the condo, you buy the townhome, the semi, or the starter home. You buy it from someone else, and then that person who's later on in life maybe needs more space, that seller can move up, and that's the chain. But if the entry buyer can't get there, the first rung or the first and second rung of that ladder are missing. Well, it's a lot harder to climb that ladder, and the whole thing gets a bit stickier.
Yeah, I think that this is why, like, the policymakers, and we'll talk about this later in the episode, like, policymakers create a lot of policies to try and stimulate first-time home buyers, because they rely on them. Like, they're the liquidity at the bottom of the market that pushes the whole market up. If they can't buy, then the buyer or the seller who is selling their house to them can't buy. And then if that person can't sell, then the next person can't buy.
Yeah, I mean, and so on and so forth. So this is for the national audience out there, and kind of use this to translate or maybe foreshadow Ontario into your own market. Okay, so in Toronto and Vancouver, the issue is obvious, right? It's extreme price to income pressure. We've talked about this so many times. In Calgary and Edmonton, the payment math might look a little better, and it does, but migration and investor demand, they can still move faster than local income, right? You're competing with some different people in markets like that. Atlantic Canada, the pressure comes from population growth, out of province capital, and lower local incomes. Similar to smaller markets here in Ontario, right? You see GTA people that, drive 3-4 hours in any direction and go buy stuff there. Montreal, a bit of a different story, different price point, but the same qualification, tough logic there. So everywhere across the country, the buyer still needs the lender approval. And when that gets harder and prices get harder and people aren't moving, this is where we end up. So, Dan, talk to me about how this has become much more of a kind of a balance sheet issue, and less of the, it's turning almost more into an investor outlook than it is the emotional first time purchase that a lot of people look forward to.
Yeah, I think that, the vast majority, we know, like, we've mentioned this data point a couple of times on the show, the vast majority of people consider their primary residence an investment, which is not, by the way.
Go listen to like 5 of the episodes that we've done on that, please.
Yeah, we've done enough episodes on is your home an investment. We got to do another one, actually.
We'll do another one this year. Yeah. It's like a yearly thing for us, just to remind everybody.
We got to remind people. But
yeah,
so I think that, we've in Canada, we've taken this approach of telling people to think about their homes as an investment for a very long period of time. The one thing I want to say, sorry, before we move on here, is just this chart crime, like in the Bank of Canada report, because we did a chart crime when we posted like one of those video charts of this, but they have like, it looks like first time home buyers are falling like crazy, but the first time home buyers use a separate scale, so it looks like they went from like, but they went from 50, like it looks like they're meeting investors, like, and their investors are about to surpass them. So anyway, I always thought that was funny in
Be
this
careful
report.
with the charts, guys. Careful with the charts out there.
Yeah. So 81% believe that home ownership is a good long-term financial investment, by the way. And so like first time home buyers, we went through like how long they're renting, etc. But 28% needed a cosigner outside of their partner or spouse. More than half of those cosigners were parents. So we're starting to get the first time home buyer market creating this like systemic exposure to bank of mom and dad, not just on the gifts. Gifts, 27% received a gift, but also on the actual mortgage credit bureau, which impacts, the parents' credit, their ability to do things. Plus, if you're taking a gift, you're borrowing against your inheritance. And so, the great house transfer that we talk about a couple of times on the show starts to get watered down by the next generation needing the liquidity from the bank of mom and dad. Yeah. So the gift share did fall from 34 to 27%. So like, I mean, that is actually probably a bit of a bright spot. I think that there's a lot of bright spots. Like when I look at this, and it feels weird to start like pointing out that, but that's to me, first time home buyers retaking control of the Ontario housing market is actually a very good piece of news, even if it comes at the consequence that they're 40 years old on average when they were 36 before. So let me ask you then, and I know you don't really work with a lot of first time buyers, but like a lot of people our age, I mean, we're in our mid late 30s. Wow, it feels weird to say that, but
don't out me on my age here, dude.
Statistically, like a lot of people in our cohort should be first time home buyers based on the data point that we mentioned, 40.
Or historically should have owned homes for years at this point. And you're right, Dan. I don't work with a ton of although I have helped a couple amazing first time investors and stuff recently, but I don't work with a ton of first time home buyers anymore just because I'm more in the commercial space. And usually if you don't own, your first condo, you're likely not going to buy a 12 unit building somewhere or something. But,
right.
I think that the way that I would advise a first-time home buyer in this market is a few things, right? Like, don't start with your dream home. Don't start and stretch yourself to get even that. Okay, well, maybe we can spend 10, 15 years here, kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with getting in and working your way up over the course of 5 years or whatever. So start looking at a monthly payment that you can really afford
or like house hacking too, right?
Yeah,
like
man, I talk about this all the time. Someone recently didn't know that term, and I was just like, "How did you not?" I was on someone else's podcast, and they're like, "We've never heard that before." I was like, I didn't come up with this, guys. This is a tried and true, but I guess it's not that popular anymore, right? But then again, with that, you want to be stress testing your own life as well. The bank's going to do it for you. Don't worry about that. But you got to know, okay, yes, I could afford this, but as Braden, one of our podfathers used to say, am I eating dirt and ramen in that case, right? Like,
just how much you want to sacrifice doesn't mean you should.
Exactly, right? So, and understand that it's income, down payment, debt. You've got credit card, you've got all these other aspects of your life, but then location and property type. There's so many things to consider.
It's that house poor fear, right? Like it's like you're not buying a Denali HD after you just levered up on a house.
I've got friends that are like, I go on vacation in 3 years because, I bought the house, right? I mean, there's memes about it too, where people are like, enjoying my home because I spent everything on it.
Yeah,
I think it's just people like walking around their house. And it's hilarious. So, at the end of the day, the simplest way to put it is don't, do what's right and don't let FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. Don't let that impact your decision whatsoever. I mean, So, anyways, Dan, that's my advice for first-time homebuyers. Let's flip the script here and talk to probably the other side of our audience. A lot of you are first-time homebuyers or will be first-time homebuyers.
Surprising
and
number of people listen to this show that are first-time homebuyers.
For sure. Well, they're listening to be like, what the hell do I do? Right now, for the other half or the other large portion of you amazing listeners out there, let's talk about investors, how they went from first to third, because that's a big fall off, right? I mean, how many other buyer groups are there really, right, that are being tracked? Like, from first to third is a huge drop. So give me the operator version. I don't, not the political. Strip this down for me and tell me why this happened.
I think it's pretty simple. Like, we've talked about it a million times on the show, so I can probably answer this one pretty quickly. Like, all of the underwriting inputs in real estate investing got worse over the last 4 years.
What? I hadn't noticed.
Interest rates went up. Prices came down, so that was improved.
Well, they went up insanely and then came down insanely, right?
Bit,
so the volatility of the market, I think, freaks people out.
Yeah, rents fell, vacancies rose, right? So so your refi assumptions broke, your valuation on the exit. A lot of those pre-con investors got wiped out. So there's a lot of people who just are negative wealth effect, like that was all capital that was getting parlayed into the next pre-con deal. Eventually the scheme runs out and there's no buyers left. And then there's negative cash flow. Disciplined investors just stopped forcing bad deals. Like, you remember in 2021, man, when people were buying properties and then I'm like, doesn't it feel like a little risky to you? And they're like, well, no, like if I do this and, this, use this metric and appreciation does that. And, I'm like, what, like you're like the rationalizing that to that scale is
called
like
cooking the books at this point, to be honest, but you're cooking your own books.
Yeah. And like they did get cooked. Like everybody who did that got fully cooked. So I think the easy way to think about it is like, the story is just harder, right? Debt service is higher, condo fees, insurance, every input was inflationary. Vacancy risk matters again. Rent growth cooled pretty much across the country. And a lot of those pre-con investors learned basically that the exit buyer who is going to buy the pre-con contract off of them is not guaranteed. And now they're landlords and they're realizing that that's not that easy as well. And you probably should have underwrote better if you were going to be a buy and hold investor.
Yeah, well said. I mean, look, when the investor bid fades, the market leans harder on household buyers, and that's a big market shift, right? The investor bid, which was so hot, there was so many of them for so long, again, quote unquote investors, for those of you listening only, that could float above, that investor capital would come and it would float above the local income for a while. Credit was loose as well. Everyone believes the next buyer is going to pay more, and that kind of messed up a lot of markets. And then that first time buyer bid, of course, is a lot more tied to income, savings, debt, family help, a big one, and of course, qualification. That is much less the magical buyer that everyone's expecting to come and purchase their property. And honestly, probably a smarter and healthier one that's going to come in and likely get a deal. So let's put this all into a bit of current market context, Dan. We talk about CREA a lot, Canadian Real Estate Association. Let's look at their national data. Kind of gives us a little temp check.
Because whenever I do the YouTube videos and it does the transcripts, it's always we say Korea, it's like Korea. I'm like, this is not about Korea.
We've got a large listenership and viewership in North Korea. You wouldn't believe it. We've somehow made it through. CREA. National sales, Dan, up 5.5% month over month in May of 2026. Annual activity shows still down 5%, just over 5%. National home price index, that's the HPI, was down over 4% year over year. New sales to new listings ratio, balanced territory. That's usually a pretty good indicator of where we are. And this, if the market was frozen over, this looks a bit more like a thaw than, someone with a flamethrower coming in heating things up.
We're not gassing up the rocket ship yet, eh? I've been told that there was going to be a bull run.
There is, baby. Just you wait.
Yeah, just wait. It's anytime now.
Just keep waiting. Yeah.
Stackhand has some interesting data on this too. The national balance sheet context basically is like household credit market debt is still enormous. Like Canadians are just still pretty levered to the gills. I think our actually I should pull up the Desjardins charts if I get a chance for the video, but we were deleveraging coming out of the pandemic, came down to like 170 something, and then it's been steadily climbing. I was feeling really good. I'm like, Canadians are finally getting rid of it, shaking off the debt. And, now we're back at 180. So it's like, we're back at 180. I think we got down to 170 or 171. That's like debt to household income. So, it's like easiest way to think about this is, you go to the bank. If you're a real estate investor, like you go to the bank and you're like, hey, I want to borrow X amount to buy this investment property. And they're like, well, you got finance CDs and, you got like 2 big trucks and you already owe like 3 million in mortgages. Like, I'm just probably not going to give you any more credit.
Are you sure this is a good idea?
So you take that idea and spread it out over the entire economy, and it makes it very easy for you to understand that Canadians have just run out of borrowing power, right? Like banks don't want to lend us more money because we already have too much debt at a national level. So weaker buyer capacity is, I want investors to think about this because it matters obviously for our first time home buyers, but or whatever, any buyers, but us as owners of property, it matters to us whether or not we have buyers for that property, right?
Yeah, that's
so it's an owner balance sheet
market
problem.
Yeah, for sure. Right. I mean, and this is also where, Dan, you mentioned it, the great wealth transfer. We coined it the great space transfer, the great house transfer here in Canada, where the majority of wealth will be through real estate, whether it be cottages, primaries, that condo you bought thinking it would skyrocket, or, multiple, your investment properties. You can have a country full of paper housing wealth and still have weak transaction volume if that next buyer, that magical buyer everyone's waiting for, can't finance the exit price that current owner needs to exit, right? And here we are kind of tripping over ourselves. So,
and this is a big problem. Like when you talk about the great space transfer, like I've been like trying to write a book around this called The Great House Transfer, because I feel like it's like needs to be explored. Like what's going to happen when baby boomers all need to sell their houses and there's no exit liquidity because the next 2 generations, millennials and Gen Zs, don't have jobs. They're not good paying jobs. Price to income's insane. All of these things. It's a big question. So anyway, it's a fascinating thought experiment to me.
Yeah, well, there you go. Stay tuned for Dan's book on the subject. But yeah, speaking of kind of tripping over ourselves, Dan, let's get into a bit of the kind of policy trap that is, of course, a character in this story, right? It wouldn't be Canada if policy wasn't working against us a little bit. Every time a first-time homebuyer struggles, the government then tries to help them borrow more. Is that a real solution, or is that just, another Band-Aid, another Band-Aid, another Band-Aid?
Well, you see this with like the condo bailout stuff and the rent to own and whatever. It's like, these are all just demand side stimuluses. It's always like, make the mortgages longer, make the down payments smaller. Now we'll make them rent to own. And the policymakers always want to do this because like nobody is going to vote against helping first-time homebuyers, but they're also not going to analyze the outcomes. And by adding more demand, like in a supply-constrained market, it just moves the bid. And so you have to be careful over supporting your first-time homebuyers.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you need the buyer to feel helped. You need them to feel like it's possible, but you can't just keep stacking more and more leverage and debt, because then the system gets dependent on that, and it's that kind of negative feedback loop that we're in the middle of right now.
Yeah, exactly. Like the next buyer needs the next program. And that's why the 40-year age stat matters. Like governments are putting policy to try and make this easier for this group that, without anything to not acknowledge the real problem, which is, like honestly. So like, give me a couple of things that like you would encourage anybody, and I think especially investors, to think about the way that the government is putting policy towards this stuff. Like just questions that you might ask yourself when we're analyzing things like a lot of the dramatic housing policy that we're fortunate enough exists that keeps this podcast running. Thank you to the government for always doing crazy stuff. for us to talk about. But
What
like,
would
what,
we talk
yeah,
about? Yeah.
how do you like, what lens are you applying when you're thinking about policy around first time buyers, investors, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, Dan, look, you and I have done, I feel like, a pretty good job kind of playing nonpartisan, playing neither side too heavily, right? We've both been tenants, we've both been investors, we've both been homeowners, et cetera, et cetera. And we look at this stuff every day, and we've looked at it for years at this point, right? So I like to look at it from a lens of, how is this going to affect me as a tenant? How will this affect me as a landlord? How is this going to affect my tenants? How is this going to affect my kids, my friends, all that kind of stuff? And here's some of the things that I know that we've spoken about, both on and off the podcast, right? Are we actually helping buyers buy, or are we helping sellers hold that price, right? As the things are so inflated that we can't let the air out a little bit, are we actually really increasing the housing supply, or are we just increasing the bid capacity for the existing homes? Are we, again, trying to solve affordability? This is the big one. Are we trying to solve affordability, or are we just stretching out the payments over more and more years? So there's this, illusion of affordability. That is one that I think you and I have both struggled with over the years, as we've seen amortizations get longer, and all the, every policy that comes out that aims to help just kind of really stretches it out a little bit more. And, um, are we helping the median household, right? Like the average Canadian, or are the only households that, the only people that really benefiting, really able to climb that ladder and probably climb it faster than ever? Are they the ones that already have high income, family support, several properties? I mean, Dan, we've covered studies that basically say, allude to so much that if you own a property, sorry, if your parents own a property, you're 75% more likely to own a property. If your parents own multiple properties, you are more likely to own multiple properties. So, lots to think about, and some tough questions, some uncomfortable stuff, wrapped up in all that.
Yeah. Speaking of questions, I'm going to give some practical takeaways quickly here, and then I'm going to ask you an interesting question, because I
Uh-oh.
like, we have a Toronto multiplex event coming up, and anyway, I don't want to tease it too much, but a big theme right now is a lot of the guys who are doing your CMHC, MLI Select, defined rental takeout, are revisiting a lot of the numbers against falling rents and rising bond yields, and the math of building a rental breaking a little bit, and saying, what if I built these as condo townhouses, and I actually sold them as townhouses? Well, who am I going to be selling that to? So before I do that, first time buyers, practical takeaway, I think, is like, actually benchmark against your real constraint, not what your parents tell you to do, or like your parents' income, or all of those things. Like, if you need that much support to get there, I think you got to ask yourself if this is the right financial decision for you. And I think a lot of people don't do that. It's like capitalism and the way that we distribute money. Usually, one of the easiest ways to attract investors is by being good at making money. So, but then if you get good at making money, then you don't need to attract investors. And one of the best ways to show that you're good at, or to communicate that you're good at making money, is put your own money into stuff and then make money with it. If family help is a big part of the plan, like, be honest about it early, and also understand the consequences of that. Investors, I think, is like where it gets a little bit more interesting, because we talk about exit buyers, and I think this is going to get even more interesting when you start thinking about MLI now being proposed for 3 and 4 unit buildings. CMHC's thing, one of their surveys was showing 28% of people have a secondary suite in their house. Did you know that? 28%.
Yeah. No, we covered it on the show, man. It was crazy.
Yeah,
It's
crazy.
happy to hear it.
Then a huge amount of people want to add them, and so let me ask you the question, like, because I think investors really need to be thinking about exit. Who you're selling this to. We talked about this a lot when we were running the course, which is now all free, by the way. All of our course stuff is like, just get in there, absorb it. It's all available. But what would you say to an investor, if they're making a multiplex and cutting up the 4 units and selling them as pre-cons, or as whatever, brand new homes to some exit buyer, or just an investor who owns like an entry level up down duplex or whatever, basement suite, where they're buying a property, that the likely exit or the likely thing that you're relying on is a first time home buyer?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably well positioned by the sounds of it in this market, right? I mean, we're seeing the resurgence of first time home buyers. We're seeing that they're coming to the table with money, whether it be a combination of their own money, their partner or spouse's money, and mom and dad's money, or both sets of parents. I would do it in the same way that we've approached all of our investing, Dan. Reverse engineer it. Think about the buyer pool before you have that offer, right? So think about, instead of making it a one bedroom, maybe it should be a two or two plus so that you can grow into that home, right? You want to make sure that you can compare it and make a compelling case for home ownership versus, them continuing renting. Of course, location for first time home
Yeah.
buyers getting into
It
that type of product is huge.
it almost like makes you think about it from like a landlord perspective as well, because if these people are renting for on average 7 years before, how do I design product to capture them for a longer period of time, create a product that's marketable that they can live in for a longer period of time to reduce my turnover and all of those things. Because people who are on the path to becoming first time home buyers, often more financially qualified tenants, et cetera, like that would be a good individual to design rental product around as well.
And I mean, you and I, and not to plug the multiplex event again, but like that is what we're talking about, right? I mean, like you've got all these first time home buyers or downsizers or people, that have had, they've worked their way up the property ladder. Now they want to get off and get back on one of the smaller rungs kind of thing, right? The first time home buyer or the second home. Um, I think this is where, the lack of an elevator, the fact that you're a front door or a staircase away from being outside, having a yard that, you can take your dog, you can take your child out kind of thing, being in a bit more of a rural feeling, but still in the city and having all the amenities close by, that's what I find is really important. And that's what we're seeing a lot of people doing with the multiplex stuff, not only here in Toronto, but across Ontario and Canada. And I think it's really starting with that end user in mind, right? And we know
Yeah,
what that we have the data. We know what that end user looks
it's
like. So
it's it's interesting because like we can just wrap up with this here, but like the we when we talked about our Vancouver multiplex event, one of the things that surprised us most was how much it was being designed around ownership. And
yeah, exactly.
yeah, so they like, and we were like, when is that going to come to Toronto? And then all of a sudden, like, the people who are like all the deals that I'm seeing right now, like the amount of deals that I have that the owner or the multiplex buyer is underwriting it as, we're calling them condo plexes now, but like similar to the stratified title that you'd see in Vancouver or Montreal. A lot of people are doing that because the rent becoming very hard to be competitive as a landlord for these plexes with falling rents. Even though it's better product than a lot of the condos coming on the market or whatever, people will settle for, and we're learning tenants will settle for an inferior product if they're getting it for way, like 40% less than they're paying for the plex. So you know
Yeah.
a lot of people are exploring other, and I think that's going to be that. I think the two things that we're going to talk about the most at the multiplex event will be what does it look like if hopefully we have an answer by then. Like I know you and I have both got the email from the government for the consultation on
Yeah.
this, CMHC MLI Select, if it goes to 3 and 4 units. But if we don't have an answer, then we're just going to sit there and theorize what would it look like if Canada Guarantee and Genworth or Sagan got into private insurance of basically investor mortgages. And what would it look like if MLI was available on 3 and 4 unit buildings? And then the other piece I think we're really going to be talking about is all of these investors that we're seeing pivoting towards becoming like basically home builders, man. Like multiplex investors become, and I'm not going to lie, like that was actually, I did think that this was one of the primary ways that we would deliver supply. That was a prediction that we made on the show in 2022, and we nailed it because it already happened in Toronto. And that's
Citizen
great.
developers, baby. Here
And
we
I
go.
started to I think we've started to theorize that this would be one of the primary ways, as you're starting to see this huge purpose built rental boom and all of these large format purpose built rental landlords coming into the space, that this will actually start becoming one of the primary ways that we deliver ownership housing, which is a fascinating like plot twist, or like character development for the multiplex asset class, right?
Yeah. It's so exciting, man, because it just continues to change. And I think the fact that, the first time home buyer is now 40 completely changes that and plays into the multiplex strategy so well. So, I mean, look, all in all, the first time home buyer is still around. They just maybe have a couple more gray hairs or wrinkles than they used to. If you're a
I'm gonna have
boomer,
gray hair by the time I'm 40.
oh, dude, I got buddies that are fully gray at this point.
I'm just bald, so that's like that. I guess
Or
my hair
you've
falls
lost
out
your
before
hair,
it turns gray.
or you've lost your hair. Yeah, I mean, look, the first time home buyer likely isn't that early 20s rosy cheeks, working a normal job type of. Those days are long gone, right? Broccoli hair. Yeah, I mean, look, 40 years old. I remember being in my early 20s. And thinking I'm going to have a Ferrari and, I'll be a multi-millionaire. I'll have it all figured out by 40. Then you get to 35 and you're like, oh, maybe not. And then, I'm sure 45 is the same thing. But all in all, it is an interesting data point that I think speaks volumes about where the market is, what it means
Makes
for investors, what it means.
Podcast episode title too.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Average
there you go.
First time home buyer, 40 years old.
And it's probably worked because if you heard that, you've listened to the whole thing. And on that note, thank you so much for listening. As always, if you liked what you heard, go leave us a review or, say something funny about being 40 years old.
Ask us a question in the reviews, whatever. Honestly, just what any excuse to hit a 5-star review and put some text in there. We'll take it. Like, you want to ask us a question, you want to, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, thanks. We'll see you soon.